It's my very great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to Siouxsie Wiles, Associate Professor at the University of Auckland, and among many accolades, actually, New Zealander of the Year as well. So I've written down some biographical notes, but I'm slightly worried because Siouxsie, one of her things has been a professional skeptic, so she's tuned in to fact versus fiction. But you know, Wikipedia's right, Siouxsie. There's a few things I just might highlight. Firstly, that Ebola sparked your interest in this career that you've embarked on, and you know, it's a bit terrifying to think that Ebola can spark personal interest, but there it is. A microbiologist, strong interest in many areas, including antibiotic resistance, which I think for many countries is sort of the thing that's hidden, but is a real risk for us all, and certainly in a country like New Zealand where we rely on animals for a lot of our well-being and income, and developing new antibiotics. So I guess our audience is Auditor Generals, and it would be a bit strange to say, you know, a microbiologist and Auditor General, but I think Siouxsie also has interest in a range of areas that are quite significant to us as Auditors General, and some that I've written down. She's a science communicator, so making really hard concepts easy to understand, generally by the public, but also at times like this by politicians as well. What are the real essence of the issues we've got in front of us, and what's the science say? So that's a very much in the Auditor General space. You know, what is it? It's really hard to explain what we do, but you really need to take notice of this. And I think that's certainly one key connection with us. I think the other thing, Siouxsie's found a way to influence the public. And for all of us that write reports and issue them into the world, the one thing we really want is the public to do something with them. And it's a real trick to get that to happen. And Siouxsie may talk about some of the tricks she's used, but certainly influential in New Zealand and to some extent across the world with the flattening the curve concept. And as I said before, a bit of a professional skeptic. You know, facts over fiction, it's a world that really requires facts over fiction, and certainly home territory for Auditor General. And I was looking for a definition, and when I went to one, it said, this is for the Skeptics Society, we're the ones who say the emperor is not wearing any clothes, and then we say, haven't you noticed? Which I think is a wonderful definition of a skeptic, and sort of a bit of a definition of an Auditor General's role as well. So all these skills really important for Auditors General. How do we connect? How do we make change happen? How do we take difficult concepts and make them real and tangible and give people calls to action? So really looking forward to your presentation, Siouxsie. It's a great honour for us to have you here, and I'll pass it over to you. There is a discussion forum where people, I'm not sure if you can see it, we're not sure what people can see sometimes, but there'll be people perhaps asking comments as we go through, and if you don't see them, and we might ask some questions at the back of that if you've got time. But welcome, and over to you, Siouxsie.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to come and speak to you all today. So what I've decided to do is really just talk a little bit about my, I guess the past 18 months for me, but a little bit about the sort of communication that I've done, but also a little bit about how I ended up, I guess, being a science communicator, and especially one in this pandemic. So as you've just heard, I'm a microbiologist, and yes, Ebola did spark my passion for microbiology. I was amazed by how something as tiny as a virus or bacterium, when it gets inside of our bodies, can sometimes cause such havoc. And I wanted to know, how did they do that? And more importantly, how did we stop them from doing that? And so it's been a real privilege to be able to make a career out of trying to understand microbes. My area of speciality is actually bacteria rather than viruses. And then to use that information to try to find new antibiotics and things like that. So that's my day job really, is as an associate professor, as a university lecturer, and running a research lab, actually doing projects to try and understand these kind of amazing and horrifying microbes. But for me, yes, during the pandemic, I guess I've become really well known as a science communicator. And the reason for that is because as a publicly funded scientist, I'm really, really clear that science and research doesn't end with a journal publication. So that's often how it's treated, that we do our research and then we write it up for our peers and we have it published in a journal. But actually, as we've seen during the pandemic, that's not the only audience that needs to understand that research. Depending on what your research is, and this will be exactly the same for the auditors general, there are lots and lots of different people who need to understand what it is that you do or have done. So that means for me, I have spent the last 10 years or so trying to learn how to communicate complex scientific information to different audiences and in different ways. And I guess if I was going to sum up my talk in just sort of two things, what is the secret to success as a communicator? I think the first one is practice. So I have had a lot of practice. And then the second one is to collaborate with those, who have skills and expertise in communication. And so as you'll see as I go through my presentation, that is something that I've really tried to do by, taking opportunities to work with different kinds of people who communicate in different ways. So just taking you back then to 2010, when my my real kind of communication journey started, it started with blogging. And so I had a blog on the Science Media Centre's SciBlog site. It was called Infectious Thoughts. And I used to write mainly a post every week called Monday Micro that was just explaining a science, microbiology related story, a paper that I'd read. Or was talking about an outbreak of something that had happened at the time. So this picture is just showing a post that I wrote about a food poisoning outbreak that was happening in Germany at the time, talking about the science behind this, because it was related to an organism that I had done some of my research from during my postdoc years. So this was, I guess, a place to learn how to write less academically. So how could you kind of engage a different audience? And through these regular writing, I started to get asked to do interviews on TV about sort of microbiology related stories. But I also was asked to become the science commentator for Radio New Zealand's 9 to Noon program. So every fortnight for nearly 10 years now, I have basically had the opportunity to pick 3 science stories and then talk to the public about those 3 science stories. And actually, if I listen back to my first few interviews, I probably sounded terrified. And I've learned to become much more comfortable about talking about science, and my own science, because I talk a lot about, other areas, just talking about what we do know, what we don't know. And through that, I really wanted to get people to understand a little bit more about the process of science. So how do you do research? If you have a question, how might you go about answering it? Those kinds of things. So just to be a little bit more open, I guess, about the kind of black box that is research. So that's been an amazing opportunity. I feel like I've learned how to communicate then, without any visual aids because it's radio, but also to learn about a really broad range of different kinds of science and to communicate that to the public. Other things I've been involved in are things like working with animators and illustrators. So this is just a little picture of a still from an animation that I made with an animator back in, 2012 maybe now. And I'd seen a little video on YouTube that was about the placebo effect, and it was 2 minutes, and it was just beautifully done. I thought this was, it was a great way to explain really complicated science using these beautiful visuals. And so I contacted the animator saying, how much do you cost? Because I'd love to learn how to communicate in this way, not to do the animation. That's obviously a specialist job, but to learn how to tell a complicated story in 2 minutes. So I raised the money to pay for his services, and we ended up making a series of animations that were about creatures that glow, like fireflies and glowworms, because that's one of my passions. But then also how scientists use their light in science. So that relates to some of my research, but research done by others as well. And so we've just put these out on YouTube for anybody to see. The one that you can see in front of you is about fireflies and the search for extraterrestrial life. And this one showed at the International Science Film Festival in New York. I didn't get to go to New York though. Through those videos online, an artist got in touch with me about doing some living art. And so this has led to a whole sideline of doing collaborations with artists. So I have identified and isolated a bacteria that glows in the dark that's completely harmless. It comes from the ocean. And we have this bacteria, and we can basically give it to anybody who wants to draw with it. And the idea is that we give them a petri dish. So this is the thing that bacteria grow on. We give them a little solution of this bacteria, and then wherever they paint is where the bacteria will grow, and wherever the bacteria grow is where they will glow. So we've done lots of really cool art installations with children, giving them little petri dishes and getting them to draw. But what you can see in front of you is a photograph from an installation we did with a whole series of artists. So we gave these artists big petri dishes, and lots of them. Each of those little squares is 25 centimeters by 25 centimeters. And then they basically drew their works of art, and then we displayed them. And then the next day, people got to see them. What I loved about this actually is it's quite challenging for the artist, because it's like you're drawing on jelly with invisible ink. You know, they can't see what they've drawn until the next day when the bacteria have grown. But it was a really great way, you know, having these installations was a great way to talk to people about science, about microbiology, but in this really different context, right, which is in the context of an art exhibition. And that's been really, really fun. So as well as doing that, I have made a little web series with my daughter Eve about microbiology. So that was just 4 little episodes. And the idea was that I was her sidekick. She was learning something about microbiology. She would go and interview scientists. My favorite episode is when we isolated bacteria from between our toes and then went to a cheesemaker to make cheese with it. And so if you've ever wondered why there's a distinct smell of smelly feet when you think of some cheeses, it's because the same bacteria grow between your toes as do in smelly cheese. So we made that series. And then I've also, a few years ago, wrote a book about antibiotic resistance. And so this was designed to be read in just a few hours for a general audience, and was another opportunity to learn how to communicate my research and the wider impact of the things that I'm interested in science-wise to a much larger audience. So all this is to say is that pre-pandemic, I had already won numerous awards for science communication: the Prime Minister's Science Communication Prize, the Royal Society Te Aoparangi's Callaghan Medal, and in 2019 was made a member of New Zealand Order of Merit for services to microbiology and science communication. So all this is to say that it's been 10 years of essentially, I guess, training for a marathon that I didn't really realize I was going to run. So when the pandemic arrived, for me, it just felt very much like normal. So I have at many times over the past few years, responded to journalist calls about infectious diseases. So whether it was the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, Zika virus, if everyone remembers that, I've been the person that journalists will go to and ask what's going on here. And so that's exactly what started happening for me in mid-January last year, was my phone started ringing and people were saying, what is this virus in China? And so I started doing television and radio. Most of that in the early days was, we don't know. This is very much a, watch and see. But I guess it became really clear within a couple of weeks that this was something quite extraordinary and nothing like we had really seen before. So one of the things that I started doing on the side of also of doing the TV and the radio was starting to write. And so this is sort of going a bit to my blogging, back to my blogging days. But then in this time, I wasn't writing for my blog. I was writing for an online media organization here in New Zealand called The Spinoff. And I've written for them in the past, but the editor, Toby Manhire, approached me and said, if there's anything that you'd like to write for us, then, please do. And what I love about being able to write is that you can actually put everything that you're thinking down. So here was a place that I could, rather than just having my some of my thoughts captured in a soundbite for an interview, I could actually say, here's what we don't know, here's what we do know, here's what I'm thinking, and have it all written down there for people to see. So I started writing quite regularly, just things like, how do we talk about this virus to children? I prepared a pandemic preparedness plan for my lab and I shared that. I was trying to just get people to understand, what will get us through this, how might we need to behave. And so for all of those things, what I was trying to do was remain calm, because it's very clear from the research that if you're not calm, you'll panic, and you'll tend not to act in your best interests. I wanted to be transparent, so I wanted to show people what it was that I was reading or looking at, so what my thinking was. I wanted to be accessible. I wanted to show my values, and I think this is very important, because we often have we have this idea that science is objective, and yet it's done by people. And as we've seen during the pandemic, people can look at the same evidence and come to very different conclusions about action based on our values. So I wanted people to be really clear about who I was as a person, because that informs what my advice is going to be. And then the other thing that was really important to me was that I wanted to be sure that I wasn't stigmatizing in the way that I was writing and talking about things. And that can be challenging when you're working in this space. So a few other things that I got involved with. I did this little online kind of live web sort of series with the person that I'd done that show with, my daughter. So his name is Damien Christie. He's a former journalist and runs his own company called the Aotearoa Science Agency. And so the idea was that we set up an email address that people could email with their questions. And then when New Zealand was at alert level 4 and moving into alert level 3, we just did several times a week we would go on, I would pick a topic and talk about what the research was around that topic or how it was changing, and then we would answer people's questions. And it was mostly questions around the lockdown and what were people allowed to do and what were they not allowed to do. But it gave people an opportunity to ask somebody, those questions. The other thing that I have done is, so in this kind of be accessible, try to be available to people who wanted, just talking through what the evidence was around the pandemic. So this is just a little screenshot of me doing a Zoom hui with some leaders from different religious faiths and congregations. So it was when we were in our first alert level 3 and we were moving down, and there were reports of people wanting to meet as congregations, even though the rules were very clear about gathering sizes and things. And so I met with these leaders to talk them through what we understood about where transmission happened, why their congregations would see large numbers of transmissions if they did meet. So just to get them on board to talk to their congregations. The other things I've done have been some videos for essential workers. So this is for Sanford & Sons, making videos about mask wearing, hand washing, various things like that. Again, just to explain what the rules are, what the company had decided, and why those rules were in place. I also met with Vector and their pandemic team to talk about their plans as we were moving down the alert levels. They had some great plans around protecting their workforce, and just going through them and sense checking those, what was appropriate, what could they maybe get rid of, in light of the changing evidence that we were seeing. And then probably one of my most fun things was doing a little video with this puppet called Avon for children about wearing masks, how to do that safely, and kind of turning that into a sort of fun thing. But I guess what I'm best known for here in New Zealand is my, and around the world actually, is my collaboration with the illustrator Toby Morris. So he's somebody I've long admired as an illustrator. He's done these amazing comics, but about really important issues like inequality. And so I've long admired his work. When I saw this tweet back in February last year, which explained this concept of flatten the curve, it was something that I wanted to write about for the spin-off. And so I contacted our editor, Toby Manhire, and said, did he think that Toby Morris would be interested in working with me on a version of this graphic that I thought would do a better job of telling the story of flatten the curve. So having never met Toby before, within an hour, we were on the phone together discussing what then became the Flatten the Curve graphic, which we released on the 9th of March last year. And so this, if you're not familiar with this, so our graphic toggled between these two kind of realities, one where the virus is just allowed to go through and very quickly overwhelms healthcare. And that was kind of with an attitude that was just sort of the cold or whatever. With the alternative, which is that being careful, not panicking, doing all the things that we needed to do, we could slow down cases and keep below our ability to look after people. So we released this. One of the decisions that we made really early on, this was very important to me, was to release our graphic under a Creative Commons license. So this gives very explicit permission to for the license that we used to republish, to copy, to modify in some way, providing that you put the same things on the new license and that you credit us. So what I was thinking here really was that if this information was going to be useful, it would be really good for it to be translated into other languages. And so that's and it was a difficult thing, I guess, for Toby, because as an illustrator, he's used to not giving away his stuff for free. So this is a very different thing where we give it away and we are very explicit about people being able to modify it. So what we did was we would put the piece, so the illustration, in a longer form piece that I wrote for the spin-off, and then we released them also on social media. And very quickly this went viral on social media. So we had millions of impressions on Twitter just within a few hours, really. And then exactly what I'd hoped started to happen. People started to translate it. And so we started to see it moving all over the world in these different languages. And then everybody started talking about it. So it featured in various online publications, and even our Prime Minister here in New Zealand actually held it up during one of her briefings, talking about how we were going to approach COVID-19. And really that was the start of an incredible collaboration between Toby and I, where we have just tried to keep people up to date with how things have been progressing in the pandemic. And to show, I guess, to empower people a little bit to see how they could, how their actions could really help or make a difference. So we've gone viral several times, but this is the one, I think, after Flatten the Curve that ended up being very successful. So it explained the concept of exponential spread, so showing these transmission chains and how one case very quickly becomes many cases. And then showing how our actions can stop us being part of a transmission chain. So this was before we moved into our alert level 4 here in New Zealand. So this was back in March last year. And it had things that were relevant to us here in New Zealand. So working from home, not going to a barbecue, not flying, and just showing how you could then end up not being part of a transmission chain. And so this one, as I say, went viral as well. And this one was adapted by governments and organizations all around the world who took their sort of own take on it. So we've got here some that have been adapted by Australia and Germany. The picture you can see is a bus shelter in Germany. They put it into that. So we saw this used many times, and people would change the advice depending on what was relevant to the particular place that was using it. We've had lots of requests as well from people to use our work, to adapt it in certain ways. Obviously, the license that we have just says you're free to do this, but some people have got in touch with us. And then they've also shown us what they've done with it. And I think this is, for me, is one of the most confronting, which was somebody who got in touch with us from the US, who was working with the youth justice system in the US and was basically wanted to educate people about ways that they could stop young people catching COVID-19 in the youth justice system. And so, whereas our graphic had "don't go to this barbecue," this one has things like issuing verbal warnings rather than arresting young people. So it's quite confronting, but I guess ultimately rewarding that people found our work useful in this way. So we have gone on to do about 40 graphics now, covering all sorts of things. This one that you can see is to explain the new variants. So this graphic was used to explain how these variants arise. So using this analogy of a bike lock, and how these little rings kind of change, and then how those change and end up with different variants of the virus. We have done things on vaccination, so explaining the different ways to make a vaccine, because there are lots of different strategies and technologies that are being used. And then this one here is specifically about the Pfizer vaccine, which we're rolling out here in New Zealand. So again, we just want people to be really informed, to have the most up-to-date. Because things are changing so fast, we've started doing things like adding dates to our things, and then also adding little asterisks to say things might change, with the new variants. One of the things I've actually also really enjoyed is this sort of, trying to make sure that people understand the research and the science. And one of the things that was really clear quite early on is that, researchers, scientists use different language. We've seen this, everybody's becoming an epidemiologist. The language that we're using nowadays was really different to the language the public understood a year ago. And so we wanted to help people understand these new terms. So one of my favorite graphics was this, was just this little dictionary of a few of the different terms that were that people were hearing. And it was primarily to explain the concept of elimination, because, eliminate is a word that in normal language means get rid of completely. But in epidemiology terms, it means to get rid of or bring down to a really low number in a small place. If we want to get rid of something completely, that would mean to eradicate. And so in this graphic, we took that term, but also others. So this picture you can see in front of you is to explain the word model, which in normal terms, is a small replica or a person who demonstrates clothes. But in science and research, it's about a simulation or representation of the real world. So we've got there a fruit fly, we've got a mouse, and we've got a computer model, the actual equation that is used in New Zealand, or was originally used in New Zealand, to estimate what our case numbers would be if the disease came through. So I'm also a bit of a nerd, and so we made sure that there was also little tweaks of actual science in our graphics. So as I say, we've done about 40 of these. They're all collected together on the Spinoff's website. If you just look for bumper box and Toby Morris and Siouxsie Wiles, you'll find all of our things. As I say, they cover everything from contact tracing, explaining the lag, what the disease course looks like, explaining PCR testing and serology testing, all of these things that we've tried to kind of keep people up to speed with. Okay, so through all my communication, I guess I've really wanted to be independent of government, so to support, what people were hearing, but from an independent place. I really wanted to be able to provide information in bite-sized and understandable pieces, and this is where Toby and my work has come in so well. Toby is not a scientist; he's an illustrator, and so my first job is to communicate with Toby. But between the two of us, then we will make that, that piece of research understood, and then Toby will transform it into this visual way for people to look at. And so by doing that, we wanted to make our information engaging and shareable, so that people would share it. And we've seen, our work adapted all around the world, and it's been amazing to see it be useful in different communities. One of the unexpected things that happened because of this then, and because of going viral with a few of our things, was that Toby and the spin-off were approached by the WHO to do some work for them. So they've possibly for a year now have been working on graphics and other things for the WHO, and it's been really amazing to see the work that we've done, adapted and for a more global audience, and then changed. And so these are just a few of the things that Toby and his team have done, and they've had now millions of views. And what we've done here in New Zealand between Toby and I is thought about what it might be that people need to understand, kind of workshop that and worked it to see if it works in New Zealand, and then Toby will go on and mention, show it to the WHO and see if they're interested in having it adapted for them. So that's been really, really cool. What I will finish on for the last few minutes. So I guess, this has been the most rewarding collaboration of my career. And I think one of the things that has been a little unexpected for me was that, as a scientist, I'd always hoped that I would, my research would be useful. We're trying to find new antibiotics in my lab. And so I always hoped that perhaps, we might be part of this big, broader research effort to find new antibiotics. I knew we'd probably only play a small role, but I was hoping we'd be useful. But what I've learned through this pandemic, that actually I can make a huge impact. I can make a difference, not just with my science, but with my communication skills and my understanding of science. And this working with experts in communication like Toby to make sure that people understand that science. So that has been a really, really rewarding thing. But it has had its downsides. So I don't look like a traditional expert looks like. This has been noticed by some people. And so some of the lessons learned really have been what it's like to be either a woman or somebody who doesn't look like a traditional expert when expertise is called upon. And so we've seen this around the world, but the harassment of people who've been stepping up to give expertise has been quite extraordinary. For me, that has taken the form of people constantly questioning my expertise and my qualifications. There's a man here in New Zealand who's become quite obsessed with my PhD and has written blog post after blog post and put in official Information Act requests because I guess I don't look like an expert to him. So he just doesn't think I have the qualifications that I have. So that has been quite hard. And I feel we're constantly having to prove ourselves. And this is something that often doesn't happen to my male colleagues. They don't seem to have to go through that same, oh, yes, no, I do actually know what I'm talking about sort of stage. And then the other thing that's been quite hard has been the sometimes real vitriol that has come on social media. So these are just some of the comments that were put on a Facebook page in response to a comment by a member of parliament, actually, who called me a COVID celebrity. So all of the communication that I've been doing, there are some people who think it's just because I like the sound of my own voice rather than actually passionate about people understanding, how we need to act and why. And so, the people that the things they say are really, really hurtful. Lots of stuff around my appearance, lots of stuff around my perceived lack of expertise. And so this is what we face all the time when we step up and do these roles. And so it's, while it's been immensely rewarding and I wouldn't change a thing in terms of stepping up and doing it, it has also had its downsides, including, people releasing my personal details, my home address, my phone number, on the internet, all these sorts of things, and quite a lot of abuse. Saying that, there's also been lots of positive, and I know that lots of New Zealanders are really appreciative for the work that I've done and the work, that Toby and others have done. So with that, I will, I'm really happy to answer any questions. Hopefully this has left us some time. For that, I will stop sharing my screen and hopefully this will work. Let's have a look.
Yeah, we're back on and we can see you here. So that seems to have worked at this end. Look, thank you for that fabulously interesting story and sort of chronology too, that starting with the idea of communicating science and ending up really not running the communications program for the country, but actually giving it credibility in terms of, the independent voice is one of the values you brought to the conversation, and seemed to be an independent voice, actually, although obviously from some of your correspondents didn't necessarily agree. I really liked, actually one question I've got, I really liked the values you talked about, the calm, transparent, accessible, still showing your values through the communication, not people, and independent. And I know that it's a sort of trying to link it a little bit with Auditors General, but that's what we have to do too. We're not there to stigmatise people, we're there to tell the story about what's gone on and to draw some conclusions on that story, not to, we're not there to damage people's careers necessarily or whatever. We're there to tell what's happened and the context of what happened, so that people can see for themselves and make judgments as well as the recommendations we make. And I just wondered to what extent that was an explicit, right at the start of the pandemic when you might have been heading in that direction but not quite sure how it would go, whether that was really you did sit down and think, look, I'm about to enter a bit of a whirlpool here. do I want to just make a list of things I need to hold on to while I'm in that, or was that something that really, on reflection, you've managed to maintain throughout, regardless?
So, I mean, having done communication for a long time, there are some sort of, my aim throughout a lot of my communication has been to be transparent, to open up the black box a little bit, that kind of thing. But actually, in terms of the pandemic, the three really important things for me at the very beginning were, not stigmatize, because you obviously don't want particular communities being targeted, right? When this is an infectious disease and anybody can get it. To be calm, because that's, people panic, they won't act in their best interest. And the other thing was the importance of collective action. And so, the fact that the research shows that communities that work together through a disaster are the ones that are most likely to come out the other side. And the reason I had certainly those things as my driving forces were because I had a very interesting experience probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, where I was asked to chair a session on Great Barrier Island about a pandemic. And so the idea was a pandemic had hit. Great Barrier Island was the only place left. And so how would they cope with this pandemic? Would they be able to stop the Aucklanders coming in their boats? What would they do? And so I was asked, it was a great weekend. I was asked to chair this panel. We had a virologist, we had a young adult fiction writer, we had somebody from civil defense, and then we had this amazing academic from Massey University who studies disasters and communities that get through disasters. And I just remember him talking over and over again about his research and about the fact that the communities, he talked about it as by using the analogy of coffee. He said the communities that share the coffee are the ones that are likely, to come out of a disaster, whereas those who hoard the coffee, they're not acting in each other's best interest. They're the ones who are less likely. And so when the pandemic started, I really remembered that collective action, that us looking after each other was how we were going to get through that. And that was the message I really wanted to, talk about from the beginning. And you can see that in the graphic that Toby and I put together, that we were trying to empower people to work together to do their bit, but for all of us. And I think that's been that has been an ongoing thing throughout our communication, has been, and that's obviously been the approach that New Zealand has also taken. This kindness and empathy and working together is how we do it. That was something that was really clear to me from the very early days, because of the session that I did with that expert. And so it's all being kind of evidence-led, and that was, how I wanted to behave and how I wanted New Zealand to behave. And so it's been, a real privilege to be in a position to give those messages and to have people take them on board so well.
Yeah, and absolutely. I know we've got people from all around the Pacific on the call, and they may not have known how significant your contribution was through that darkest days and continues on now. But just to amplify really your contribution, it was fundamental to, I think, that keeping people calm kind of part of the conversation. One thing that...
The calmness is really important. And actually, during our level 4 lockdown, when I was doing a lot of media still and talking to lots of journalists, I actually ended up having journalists call me and then just go, "Oh, just hearing your voice is helping me calm down." And so I've had that feedback a lot from people, that the minute they saw me in the pink, they felt like their blood pressure was already lowering. So it was that is how I want to behave. It is that kind of like, let's be calm, because when we're calm, we can be a bit more sensible. And that's just an approach that I will continue to take, because it's, one that's really, evidence has shown is in our best interest.
There was the toilet paper incidents that I think swept the world for a while, which we could have done a little infographic on, might have helped us all. He says rather uncomfortably. The other point, I guess, I was, and you've had a long history of science communication, and certain media, Radio New Zealand is one example where you pointed out, there was a following for that, and there was an interest in it, and that sort of that audience, I think, would be one that would tune into wanting to understand more about the world. During COVID, of course, everybody wanted to know the facts, or, well, in most countries, everyone wanted to know the facts and to work on the facts. And So they were naturally wanting information. There was a time when information was really relevant to them. It was helpful. And as you say, you'd built a narrative in the media and elsewhere where you were able to access those people with real information and they believed it. A challenge for Auditors General is that surprisingly not everyone's interested in our work every day. So yeah, I find it difficult to believe, but apparently there's people out there that don't hang on every report we do. Any thoughts about that sort of activating interest? And we do things like simple graphics and, try and make things, as complex issues as easy as we can, although, we often don't quite make that in my office, let alone I'm sure everywhere else we will find challenges. But that idea of building an audience for your area of interest and how you've gone about it, that would be really interesting if you've got any observations on that. And then we've got some questions from the floor.
Got a question. Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing. So people are interested, but they have to know why, right? So I guess the thing to reflect on is why is it important that people understand what you do and the reports that you're putting out, and then rather than working with illustrators and picking people who really are really good at that why. This is why I wanted to work with Toby Morris, because I've read his work over the years and he makes me care about it. And so he's got a really good sense of, why, like answering that why question. So I think, reflecting on that and then working with the right people, with the right communicators to put those messages out in ways that appeal to different types of people. And, I think people do want information about stuff. Sometimes they just don't know that they want it because it hasn't been framed in the right way. So yes, thinking about that framing, why should people care, and then answering that question for them, really, I think is the way to go.
We've got a question which several have indicated they'd be really keen to hear you answer. And that is, what are the first steps you would recommend somebody take if they're not accustomed to doing live radio and TV interviews?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. Giving talks is a really good way to do that, right? There are groups everywhere that like to have speakers. Here in New Zealand, we've got the University of the Third Age. There's all sorts of groups who want interesting people to come and talk to them. And so that's sort of where I guess I started to learn those skills as well, was by talking about stuff and then learning. Because when you do talks, you can also watch people's body language, so you can see where you're losing them. For my stuff, I actually got my start talking in schools about my research, and children are brutal. So you very quickly learn, what's working, what's not working, how to explain things differently. And then with everything, the more you practice, the better you get. And so I think knowing that being kind to yourself and each other, that you're going to make mistakes and it's okay that you make mistakes while you're learning. And, even when you're an expert, you will still make mistakes, right? So that acknowledgement that you're not going to be perfect all the time and that everything's about growth and learning. It's not about failure. I think those are important things, to be kind when you make mistakes. There are often times on the radio where Catherine Ryan will ask me a question about the topic that we're talking about, and I don't know the answer. I'm not an expert in that area. I'm just sort of, an enthusiastic amateur who knows about some science, but not all of it. And so I say, I don't know. That's a great question. We should try and find that out. And so, I think talking to people and acknowledging that it's okay to make mistakes are the first places to go, really.
Oh, that's really helpful.
Yeah, I think that we have quite specialist audiences like you do as well. Obviously, Auditors General report in many ways, but one of the ways, and I completely resonate with your academic description, where you can see the publication in a journal as an important finish to a product rather than actually what impact it has in the world. And to some extent, academics are assessed on their research output. So, you can understand why that's been a motivator for academics. But many Auditors General around the Pacific spend a lot of time talking to their parliaments as well, where you're in quite a challenging environment, which I imagine would be quite similar to academic, often as in a challenging academic environment as well. So while we've talked a lot about the communicating to the broad masses and simplifying messages, I imagine in some of your environments you've actually got people there that are very steeped in what you know as well, and are challenging you at quite sort of fundamental levels. And I just wonder how you've adapted, quite a step between that, where you really do need to be, giving footnotes to footnotes, through to through to a general public where it's got to be really at the key message level only. So perhaps reflecting on both environments for you and how you've adapted.
Yeah, so they are very different environments, and certainly an academic environment is often very combative as well. And there are even, to such an extent sometimes that, you might be giving a talk and somebody isn't actually an expert in your area, but they just want to be heard. And so we call it, are you asking a question or are you making a statement? Because often people just make a statement. So and that can be quite challenging, especially if you're a junior researcher and there's a real this is somebody much more senior. It can be very intimidating. I think there are things around how we behave in academia. I imagine the same is true in politics and governments. There are ways that we behave that probably aren't in the best interest of all of us, and certainly aren't good ways to broker communication. Whereas with the public, it's been quite different. It's been wanting to maintain, actually, some of the criticism that I've had within academia, and it's not unique to me, it's about all science communicators, is some people are actually quite worried about making things sound too simple, because they like the idea of there being an ivory tower, and they like the idea of the prestige and privilege that is given to academia. That to me is dangerous, because it makes academia seem like a place that only certain people belong to. And we know, again, all the research shows that a really diverse people coming into organizations means it's going to be more successful. So, it's especially true in science, having people with different lived experiences, talking, joining science and doing research means you're going to get better research done. So I have always been about kind of breaking down the ivory tower a little bit, and wanting to be this whole approachable, actually going, maybe scientists, maybe academics aren't all who you think we are, right? So that's been and maybe some of them are, but some of us are trying to break those things down, right? So the trick then is, how do you maintain the science integrity when you are trying to simplify things? And that's been one of the really interesting things about working with artists and illustrators, is sometimes they might make a choice in order to communicate something better, and it's not quite scientifically accurate.
Yeah.
So, for example, a really, really good example of that is our graphic that went viral showing exponential spread. So that was essentially showing this, an R naught of 2 to 3, where every case ends up in 2 to 3 other cases arising from it. That's actually not how the virus behaves. Most people will go on to infect no or just 1 or 2 people, and then you get these super spreader events where you get lots of people, right? So technically, it wasn't scientifically correct, but it did what we needed it to do, right? And so there are times when the scientists have to grit their teeth a little bit and go, okay, it's not quite right, but actually, what's the bigger picture here? What is the concept we're trying to get across? And sometimes we need to just, go, oh, all right, we will let that one slide. And so for scientists themselves, so not being attacked by other scientists because it wasn't 100% scientifically accurate, is an important thing. That understanding the nuance of why why a decision might have been made is quite important. So yeah, that's a tricky thing. We try and make it as scientifically accurate as possible, but sometimes we, as a scientist, I accept that the message and the actions we want people to take are what's really, really important.
Yeah, it's a really an interesting sort of discussion. And it raised for me, as you were talking, the concept of gravitas in science as well as in these roles, and I think you might have touched on it when you said that, scientists aren't meant to look like you, or something, some comment like that. Hopefully I'm not being derogatory. I wasn't sure. I think you said something like that. That basically people expect scientists to look different, you know, and therefore this person can't be a scientist, you know. And one of the sort of challenges for Auditors General, and it sounds like for you trying to change the perception of the academic environment, is that whole gravitas idea that actually you do need to be able to be seen to be speaking with authority. And it seems to me that in a 21st century environment, we're holding on to ideas of gravitas that were, you know, 20, at least probably 50 years old. And it's quite a change for the public and everybody else to sort of work that through. But if you were to define gravitas now in an academic environment, and, you know, how do you hold gravitas? You know, from what I've heard, some of the things you've said, it's about being able to get your message across in a way that people can engage with it. And you get your gravitas from actually connecting rather than from being the ivory tower. But I might be paraphrasing you wrongly.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I mean, what I think of more than gravitas is leadership, you know. So there's an example where we've had for a long time, very certainly in, you know, in some countries or businesses, a real idea about what leadership looks like, who is a leader. And yet we have some really clear examples, you know. So I'm thinking of leadership as being quite authoritarian, you know, quite aggressive, sometimes quite bullying. But actually, there are different models of leadership, right? So you can be more kind and empathetic. And actually, it's turned out that those are the models of leadership that work best in crises. So I think the gravitas is the same, is that we have this idea of what it looks like. But actually, you know, for me, it's been about connecting with people, about them seeing who you are, and it's seeing that you are an expert in your area. And for most people, that's enough, right? They begin to trust you. And you know, you have to earn that trust, and then you have to maintain that trust, right? So the other thing has been showing, you know, that things are complex, that we don't know all the answers. You know, what would we need to find out? Trying to explain how evidence changes. I think all of these are things that are important. And I think it's by your actions and that people see that they, you know, that they can trust you, that you're right, or that when you make a mistake, that you're happy to admit it. I think that's also quite an important thing.
I was probably asking for my own self-preservation, because I think I've got gravitas in my job description. I've always been scratching around at that one to see. So thank you. I've got some notes now. I think we've pretty much come to the end of the session, and perhaps possibly gone a bit longer. So I think it's been an incredibly engaging conversation, and your enthusiasm is infectious. I don't know if that's a word you should use, of course, with someone like you, but it absolutely has been for me, for the audience here, but also for the country over the last year. And we don't get a chance to thank many people, but I thank you for the work you've done for the country over that time. And I've also got an interesting party fact about cheese and toes. So, you know, I'm going to be the only Auditor General to tell a joke at a party. So I'm going to have that in my arsenal as well. So look, it's been incredibly enjoyable for us to have this conversation. It's been immensely useful for us as well. And just, I know how busy you are, and I know how many emails you get, some of them obviously very nice ones, but you know, your time is precious, so we greatly thank you for it.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you, and thank you for all your work too.